Going beanie-less for this video. I do actually don't wear beanies all the time, but it's a little chilly here. Anyways, a really interesting and insightful interview here with Boots Riley, being interviewed by Brianna Joy Gray of the Bad Faith podcast, former, I think, national press secretary under, Bernie Sanders' 2020 presidential campaign, and lots of other cool stuff. So let's take a listen and we'll discuss.
Issue, which is drawing a great deal of sympathy, police killings of black people. And it felt like there was a disconnect between the potential, the raw potential, the potential
Full screen. What are you doing? There we go.
leaders in academia.
Why did you freeze, you fudger?
People who didn't have
There
as
we
much
go.
at stake as politicians do, arguably. Tenured professors even didn't necessarily, I think, push forward a way to politicize and connect that to the ongoing primary in a way that I would have liked. And it feels to me in some ways that energy, it's not all over, but the energy was wasted.
For sure. Completely agree with that. This Black Lives Matter movement was the biggest protest movement in the history in the United States, and what of actual substance have we got from it? I would say piecemeal things at that. Completely agree with Brianna's point there.
In some ways.
Well, yeah, I mean, to even put it more in context, which I'm sure you've talked about on this, but paydayreport.com, they keep a lot of stats on strikes and things like that. And
Yeah.
So, according to them, back in September, they had counted 900 mostly wildcat strikes from March to September, right? The biggest strike wave we've had in the United
Since
States
the 40s.
Since the 40s, right? You could count on one hand the number of outlets, whether they're mainstream or radical, that push this fact. Now, some of those things.
It's a really good point. I haven't heard anything about those 900 strikes, mainly wildcat strikes, since I think he said September. I consume most of my news from so-called progressive or leftist media sources.
Also, not only were they militant in the fact that they're wildcat strikes, but some of them, like the one with the GE workers who said no,
ventilators.
That was a qualitative difference in what they were doing, a radical difference in where people were going with that, right? Then you had stuff like the longshore workers who shut down the whole West Coast from Canada to Mexico in solidarity with Black Lives Matter, right? Now, and this, I mean, it was a one-day symbolic thing, right? But the hopes were...
But yeah, exactly. Think about what that type of strike could do long term. You shut down all of the ports on the west coast of the United States, and you don't think we would be able to get some pretty big substantive changes really quick? I think we definitely could.
For it to catch on and go forward. Now, there were some other little things, like in the Midwest, you had restaurants where people walked.
Why does it keep doing that? He's frozen. Boots, you're frozen.
In solidarity with the longshore workers, they walked out. And in the middle of trying to create a union and using that to walk out. So the amount of folks that were willing to talk about this and promote it, as opposed to, let's say, a demonstration in the street against Black Lives Matter.
Or for Black Lives Matter.
That really dwindled. And I'll tell you this. I purposely was emailing and DMing folks to try to get them to talk about it.
Yeah.
But for some reason...
Stay hydrated.
Well, it's not just for some reason, but it is something that has that doesn't seem as glamorous or maybe not as radical the because the formal unions, you know,
We're not going to be very
which
radical
are
or
only
militant.
7% of the working class,
Mm-hmm.
have been taken over by liberals for
Yep.
so long. So
Mm.
even radicals are like, oh, how does this work? You know, and that's because
Yeah.
we haven't been doing our job at talking. Like, how do you put forth class analysis in a real way if left out of that is the fact that the class struggle, which is
Your labor.
centered around the ability
Withhold labor.
to withhold labor
Boom.
collectively.
Mm-hmm.
If people don't understand that, then we haven't been putting out those ideas.
Which I think, frankly, a lot of people don't understand that. I wasn't really, exposed to that idea until listening to a different Boots Riley interview a couple months ago.
Yeah.
Correctly. We've been telling.
It makes complete
and
sense, though.
I've been part of it. You know, like it's taken me a while to like get to this particular
Same.
idea. In that, like, you know, I've been part of things where we've had 15, 20,000 people out to stop a certain thing, and a lot of those folks are brand new, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they come out and they're like, wow, I'm here. This is amazing. Look at all these people. Now what do we do?
Yeah.
And we're like,
I don't know.
Yeah, that's
I don't
that's
know.
how I feel.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Lift every voice, you know. And
Yeah.
and the truth is because here, and I've said this before, but maybe, and so sometimes I feel try to stop saying it because I've said it so many times, but I'll say it.
No, you got to say it. That's the lesson I learned from Bernie. You got to say it every day for 40 years before it kicks in.
So many of us look at I'll say this: the left has avoided the class struggle for the last 60 years.
Since the 60s, basically,
And
yeah.
I'm talking about not just the liberals, not just the progressives,
The leftists, the radicals.
left itself as well.
I think he's right.
Has avoided the class struggle for the last 60 years. And to discuss that, you got to go back. And so since the 60s, since the beginning of the New Left. And to discuss why that happened, you have to go back before that. In the 20s and 30s, according to Julie Reichardt's documentary,
1 million card-carrying communists, because I listened to this before. Watch.
In the 20s and 30s, there were 1 million card-carrying communists in the United States. At a
Need to
time
get
when
back to
the
that.
population of the United States was only 120 million.
Almost 1%
And so you
of the
think
people.
about those 1 million, what that affect, and then all the friends and family.
God, just imagine, like, the amount of things, like, labor-wise, labor strikes and whatnot, if we still had that type of analysis, if we still had 1 million card-carrying members of the Communist Party in the United States right now. I mean, I'm one, but I don't think there's probably not 1 million of us.
And things like that. So it's a big effect. During that same time, the 20s and 30s, there were places like Alabama,
All over.
Montana, Utah, Oklahoma. Those places were considered hotbeds of communist activity by the FBI. Utah,
Like
especially.
mine strikes and stuff, I think.
And so there were things like mining strike. On top of this, like outwardly
Railroad strikes.
outwardly radical viewpoint that these struggles were having. They were based in jobs, and people were doing things like there were strikes going on all over the mines, and you had places like the Midwest, you know, occupying factories and taking it over, and in Alabama and in Oklahoma, people like shooting it out with corporate guards and things like that.
Pinkertons and whatnot.
And this was, of course, there was the regular trade union movement that was, you know, not that as radical, but then there was also
a radical element of it.
Doing this with a radical vision.
Like the industrial workers of the world.
Like Hosea Hudson, Life of a Negro Communist, and
That
see
sounds like a
that
really good
it
book.
wasn't just the white working class as
Right.
well. We see that like he says
Writing it
that
down.
he was in the Communist Party for 2 years before he realized and meeting a lot of people before he realized there were white
Life of a
communists.
Negro
Yeah.
And
communist,
then we had
Alabama.
even movements like the Marcus Garvey movement, which the cadre of the Marcus Garvey movement were all people from the African Blood Brotherhood who were part of the Communist Party. So we had this thing happening, and you'd have demonstrations in the streets of 20,000, 30,000 people and it was truly a demonstration in the sense that it demonstrated something else. It said, here's 20, 30,000 people that will shut down your industry, shut down this industry, shut down that industry. So it was demonstrating actual power.
Labor. We have huge power with our labor if we withhold it, and if that is, expanded across industry or states, there's nothing I feel like we couldn't accomplish even within this really shitty capitalist system that we have right now in the United States.
And the power that it was demonstrating came from the ability to shut down industry. And in that, and at the same time, obviously there were revolutions that had just happened all over the world,
Russia.
in the midst of happening, and then you had stuff happen, like the bonus march that was separate from maybe the most separate from that activity, but still there were militant things where they were marching to the White House, and some of them were armed, and these were military veterans wanting their bonus pay, right? And marching to the White House, many of them armed and being met by General MacArthur with tanks. So this is what was happening in the U.S. that caused there to be the New Deal. It wasn't just from getting FDR into office. Right?
He was pushed.
If you can shut down industry, you can make any politician do what you want them to do.
Yes. Preach.
Because that's who they're there serving.
Exactly.
So, but we go from that period to the period that was called for by the leaders of the Comintern, which was the United Front Against Fascism, and that took many forms. But the whole point of it was, for all these powers to unite to defeat Hitler. And the form that was called for it to take in the United States was that communists, radicals in the United States, needed to not threaten during this time, openly call for overthrowing the government, right? And so that was part of the United Front Against Fascism. U.S. is going to go defeat Hitler. Radicals aren't going to say, while that's happening, we're going to overthrow the government here, right? And so that called for going underground.
So yet another thing on Hitler's long rap sheet that we can blame him for is the end of radicalism in the United States.
And well, I won't say it was the end of they took a different tact, which which was that they were now progressives, right? They were now like organizing,
a little more subdued, kind of.
This thing, and so that went on for a good 15 years. And again, things I'm saying, I'm essentializing. I'm leaving out a lot of contradictory things, but there's a storyline here that kind of has a. So by the time House American Activities Committee comes around, they're able to point at a lot of these same people who had the same
whole McCarthyism and all the Red Scares and all that bullshit.
Been community leaders and labor leaders with an outward open call for revolution, who are now replaced by folks who believed in that same thing,
but wouldn't say it, probably.
Saying I'm just a progressive and I just want to see these small changes. So the House of American Activities Committee were able to point at them and say, they're not who they say they are.
Look at what they did before.
They're revolutionaries. They're communists. insinuated is like they've been lying about themselves, so obviously it's something to not trust.
Yeah.
Right? And so, but had they done that 15 years before, people would be like, I know they're communists. That's why I like them, because they helped me and my family move my furniture in when we were being evicted, right?
Yeah.
And so, so because of House Un-American Activities Committee and McCarthyism and all of that, combined with critiques of what happened during Stalin's time and the Communist Party's reaction and non-reaction to that, though that the biggest radical organization in the United States broke up into all these little tiny groups that became what we know as the New Left. And the New Left took on a different tact.
I don't know if he's going to talk about it now, but previous video he mentioned how, you know, up until kind of that point he was talking about, you know, the left was very concerned in the class and labor struggle and strikes and things around that, and then how it kind of completely got away from that and became more about students and marches and protests.
Than the time before that, which was to say outwardly, fuck you, I'm a communist, fuck you, I'm a radical. Matter of fact, the way that the House Un-American Activity Committee was able to be stopped was when they came to San Francisco, radicals went in there and literally said,
I am.
fuck you, I'm a communist. And it became a big rally, and they decided they didn't want
Fuck
this
you,
to
I'm
be
a communist.
to make, you know, being communist cool. So, and that was
Being communist is cool. You should be one too, though.
and also
Like me in
kind of
boots.
the beginning of the New Left in the Bay Area that had ripples all over the place. But anyway, the New Left said, fuck you, I'm a communist, fuck you, I'm a radical. And at the same time, because of being purged from
Labor movements,
formal unions that they had created,
they went a different
they
route.
also left
Labor.
organizing in the workplace and left those areas, left Montana, left Utah, left and moved to big cities. Like literally that was the campaign. Move to these big cities and focus on and a big focus was students. So but how do you organize students? How do you organize a strike with students? You could do it and it would be called a strike, but it's a different relationship, right?
Yeah.
It's a more of a symbolic thing.
Maybe organizing for a student debt strike nationally. Everybody just stop paying their student loan debt. I mean, it's one idea.
And because of not organizing in the working class, obviously, like I said, there's things like where people did try to organize. Radicals, some did do that, but for the most part, that was happening, and all of a sudden you started having demonstrations be the be all end all. Like the demonstration is the point where
Kind of see that going on now, you know.
out in the street, getting in the streets is the be all end all, and that was also the first time you heard the students are the revolution. It had no historical actual thing. Like, not that students hadn't been involved in revolution,
But they weren't like the
but
centerpiece,
idea
kind of.
this new movement that the students
Like
are
be the
revolution.
center of it,
The
yeah.
only, connection it had to truth was the Cultural Revolution, which was happening at the same time, but other than that, it wasn't it wasn't true. So then you have a different model, which is we're going to create spectacle. We're going to try to use the media, in certain ways and create this thing that's kind of this, then when you subtract the actual organizing around exploitation of labor from it, then
Where's the
it
demands?
becomes even more amorphous.
Yeah,
what
that's
you're
true.
actually fighting for, right?
That's true.
What these things are.
Well, yeah, definitely check out the Bad Faith podcast, especially when they have on amazing guests like Boots Riley. And I completely co-sign what Boots was saying there during that interview of the power that we have if we are able to rebuild, this labor movement, organize strikes across industries, across states. As he points out, there's nothing a politician wouldn't be willing to concede at that point, because their overlords, the capitalists, once they see their portfolios dwindling, because let's say we have all of the ports on the West Coast, hell, let's throw in the East Coast too, shut down for a couple weeks straight. You don't think at that point we would be able to get